The wind was a blade against the exposed rock of the Carpathian foothills. It carried no scent of life, not pine, not damp earth, only the sterile chill of high altitude and impending autumn. Below the ridgeline, 7 figures moved with the disciplined economy of predators. They were shadows, detaching themselves from other shadows, their forms blurred by the advanced camouflage patterns of their gear. This was the domain of SEAL Team 7 Alpha Platoon, and they moved as if they were born from the very rock and cold. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne. His face etched with the fine lines of a man who had spent more time squinting against foreign suns than smiling in his own was a mask of focused vigilance. Every gust of wind, every skittering pebble was a piece of data processed through an algorithm of survival he had refined over a decade of war. His trust was in 3 things: his training, his men, and the cold, hard logic of the mission parameters. Today, however, there was a 4th unproven variable. 50 meters behind him, slightly offset from the main element, was Sergeant Katerina "Kat" Volkov. She wasn't one of his. Her uniform bore the insignia of a NATO-allied Special Operations Unit, a subtle but distinct variance from the SEAL's gear. She carried not the standard-issue M4 carbine, but the long, elegant, and brutally efficient form of a Mk13 Mod 7 sniper rifle. It rested against her pack, with a familiarity that suggested it was an extension of her own spine. Marcus hadn't protested her assignment not out loud. The official request had come from SOCOM, citing Volkov's unparalleled expertise in high-angle mountainous terrain, a skill set deemed critical for this reconnaissance mission into politically sensitive territory. But her presence was a disruption to the finely tuned ecosystem of his team. It wasn't that she was a woman. It was that she was an unknown and outsider in a brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared suffering and absolute trust. His men felt it too. It was in the lack of easy banter, the slight formality in their comms checks, the fraction of a second of hesitation before acknowledging her signals. Katerina felt their skepticism like she felt the wind. It was a pressure, a weight in the air around her. She didn't resent it. She understood it. Trust in her world wasn't given, it was bled for. So she remained an island of professional calm. While the team scanned the wide arcs of the valley below, her focus was narrow, intense. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept not the obvious threats, but the spaces in between. She noted the unnatural stillness of a flock of birds on a distant cliff, the way the scree had shifted on a slope that should have been stable, the glint of something that wasn't mica high on the opposing ridge. She moved with a grace that belied the 40 kilos of gear she carried. Unlike the powerful muscular gait of the SEALs, her movement was fluid, almost silent, the tread of a hunter who knows the forest listens. She paused, dropping to one knee, and brought her binoculars to her eyes. Her breathing was slow, deliberate, each exhale a small plume of vapor that the wind snatched away. Viper 1. This is Huntress. I have a potential observation post at grid 34 Delta bearing 095, high ground. Can you confirm? Her voice over the internal comms was low and clear, stripped of any inflection. There was a pause. Huntress, this is Viper 1. Marcus's voice came back flat and professional. We see it. Standard protocol. Assume observation until proven otherwise. Stay vigilant. It was a dismissal. A gentle one, but a dismissal nonetheless. We see it. He was telling her she wasn't seeing anything his men hadn't already clocked. She didn't challenge him. She simply acknowledged Huntress copies and lowered her binoculars. Her gaze lingered on the spot. It wasn't just an observation post. The glint she'd seen was the waxing on a high-powered scope carelessly left uncovered. It was a mistake. A small one, but seasoned operators didn't make it. Amateurs did. Or worse, it was bait. She settled back into the formation's wake, her silence a cloak. The men in front of her were the hammer designed to shatter anything in their path. She was the scalpel designed for a single, perfect incision. Today, the air felt less like it needed a hammer, and more like it demanded the finest of blades. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the hand of the surgeon would soon be forced. The descent from the ridgeline was a slow, punishing affair. The terrain shifted from open, wind-swept rock to a choked valley floor, a tangled maze of skeletal trees and granite boulders the size of small vehicles. The world narrowed the sky, shrinking to a sliver of bruised purple between the canyon walls. The wind, once a constant roar, was replaced by an unnerving silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on loose shale and the strained sound of their own breathing. For the SEALs, this was simply the next phase: move fast, stay quiet, get to the objective. For Katerina, it felt like a throat closing around them. Her senses were on fire. The sniper's discipline was not just about the shot. It was about the infinite patience of the wait, the obsessive cataloging of every detail that comprised the normal state of a landscape, so that the slightest deviation screamed a warning. As they navigated a dry riverbed, she paused, her boot hovering over a set of tracks. They were faint, deliberately scuffed, meant to look a day old. But she saw the truth in the particles of dust clinging to the edges. They were still damp from the morning's thin dew. They were fresh, frighteningly so. A few meters further, she found what she was looking for. Tucked beneath the lip of a flat rock, almost invisible, was a single brass casing. She didn't touch it, merely observed. 7.62 habit4. A common round for the Dragunov sniper rifle favored by regional militias and insurgent groups. But this one was different. The brass was too clean, the primer unstruck by weather. It hadn't been here for more than a few hours. Viper 1, Huntress. She whispered into her comms, her voice a ghost in the oppressive silence. Go for Viper 1. Marcus's reply was clipped, impatient. They were behind schedule. I have multiple signs of recent passage. Fresh tracks deliberately aged. A recently expended casing 7.62 millimeter concealed. The disposition feels prepared. Suggest we halt and conduct a high ground sweep before proceeding. The team stopped, the men taking a knee, their rifles scanning the oppressive gray walls around them. The silence stretched. Katerina could feel Marcus weighing her words against the ticking clock of the mission. She knew what he was thinking. This was hostile territory. Of course, there were signs of enemy passage. It was noise, not signal. My Huntress, your concerns are noted. He finally said, his tone perfectly level, betraying no emotion. But intel confirms local militia are poorly organized. Probably a hunting party or a local patrol. We press on. The objective is 2 clicks out. We can't afford the delay. Eyes up. It was a command, not a discussion. The team rose as one, the machine restarting its forward motion. Katerina felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't his rejection that bothered her, but his logic. Poorly organized. The signs she saw were the opposite of disorganized. They were the subtle, meticulous signs of a disciplined force laying a trap. The aged tracks, the single piece of discarded brass, it was all stagecraft designed to be found by a cursory look and dismissed, lulling an overconfident enemy into a false sense of security. The SEALs' confidence, their legendary aggression, was being used as a weapon against them. She fell back into her trailing position, her senses now stretched to a razor's edge. She was no longer just a sniper. She was a sensor, a walking barometer for imminent violence. Her gaze didn't follow the path ahead, but the ridges above. She studied the shadows that lay within shadows, searching for the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel, the subtle texture difference of a camouflaged net against rock. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken potential. Every rustle of leaves was a footstep, every gust of wind through a rock fissure a whispered command. The valley continued to narrow the walls on either side, rising like accusing stone fingers. They were approaching a natural choke point, a section where the canyon floor was no wider than a highway. It was a perfect kill zone, a place where cover was scarce and retreat impossible. Marcus held up a hand, and the team halted, fanning out into a textbook defensive posture. He was cautious, but it was the caution of a man expecting a frontal assault, not the insidious, all-encompassing trap she felt closing around them. He was preparing for a fight. Katarina was preparing for a slaughter. For 3 seconds, the world was perfectly still. The silence in the choke point was so absolute it felt physical, a pressure against the eardrums. Marcus Thorne scanned the gray amphitheater of rock his rifle held at a low ready, every instinct honed by years of combat, screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. He could feel hundreds of eyes on them, a collective predatory focus that made the skin on his neck crawl. He was about to give the signal to pull back, to heed the warning that echoed now in his mind, the warning he had dismissed. But he was 3 seconds too late. The ambush did not begin with a single shot, but with a singular, deafening roar. From a fortified nest high on the western ridge, a DSAK heavy machine gun opened up its 12.7mm rounds, tearing into the valley floor. The sound was a physical blow, a brutal hammer of concussion that shook the very air. Chunks of granite exploded into shrapnel, and dirt geysered around the SEALs' feet. The textbook defensive posture they had assumed became irrelevant in an instant. It was the trigger, the conductor's downbeat for an orchestra of violence. Immediately, from a dozen other hidden positions, muzzle flashes winked into existence. AK-74s and PKM machine guns joined the chorus, their distinct cracks and rips creating a terrifying crossfire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks with angry whines zipping through the air from every conceivable angle. The SEALs were caught in the center of a perfectly engineered kill box. Training took over. There was no panic, only the violent, instantaneous reaction of men whose bodies knew what to do long before their minds could process the horror. They dove for the scant cover offered by the boulders, the impacts of incoming rounds kicking up dust just inches from them. Contact front, contact right, contact left. The calls were redundant, screamed over the comms and the unbelievable noise. They were surrounded. From behind a rock outcropping, Marcus tried to make sense of the chaos. His world, so ordered and controlled moments before, had been shattered into a million lethal fragments. He saw his point man, a young petty officer named Diaz, get stitched across the legs by a burst of machine gun fire, his body collapsing in a terrible boneless heap. Man down, Diaz is hit. The call from the team's medic, Doc. Henderson was strained with effort as he low-crawled towards the wounded man, dragging his aid bag. The thought struck Marcus with the force of a physical blow. She was right, and I walked us straight into it. The guilt was a searing white-hot poker, but he shoved it down. There was no time for it. There was only the fight. While the SEALs were pinned, returning fire at targets, they couldn't see Katarina moved differently. The initial shockwave of the DSHK blast had thrown her against the canyon wall, but she absorbed the impact and used the ensuing chaos as a shield. She didn't seek cover to hide. She sought a position from which to hunt. Scrambling up a small scree slope, she wedged herself into a narrow fissure between two boulders, a position that offered a sliver of protection and a commanding view of the opposite ridge. Her breathing was steady, her heart a cold, rhythmic drum. Panic was a luxury she had never afforded herself. Through her scope, she ignored the hornet's nest of small arms fire. That was just noise. She was searching for the conductors. Her gaze swept past the flickering muzzle flashes until she found it, the thick, dark bloom of the heavy machine gun, the heart of the ambush. Two men were serving it, feeding it ammunition, their bodies silhouetted for a fraction of a second, with each fiery burst. She had her target. But even as she settled the crosshairs, she knew a single sniper rifle was a poor answer to a weapon like that. They couldn't stay here. They were fish in a barrel, and the water was draining fast. Below her, she heard Marcus making the only decision he could. All stations, Viper 1. We are compromised. Fall back to the southern gorge, bounding overwatch, go, go, go. It wasn't a retreat. It was a desperate scramble for survival, a flight from the open killing field into the even deeper trap of the narrow gorge behind them. It was the only choice, but Katerina knew it was a choice that sealed their fate. They were running out of the fire and into the abyss. The retreat was a brutal, terrifying ballet. Under the relentless hail of machine gun fire, the SEALs executed the maneuver that had been drilled into their muscle memory since day one bounding Overwatch. One fire team would lay down a storm of suppressive fire, their M4s barking furiously at the unseen enemy, forcing them to keep their heads down for precious seconds. In that window, the other team would scramble back, moving from one piece of meager cover to the next, a desperate zigzagging run through a gauntlet of death. Then they would switch roles. Katerina became the linchpin of the withdrawal. From her fissure in the rocks, she was the only one with a stable platform and a clear, magnified view of the true threats. While the others sprayed bullets at shadows, she fired with lethal economy. Her first shot was aimed not at the men on the DSHK, but at the heavy gun itself, the 338 Lapua Magnum round, smashing into the receiver mechanism with a satisfying crack of metal on metal. The gun fell silent. Her next two shots, fired in quick succession, took out a two-man RPG team that was setting up on the eastern ridge. Her shots didn't win the battle, but they bought moments. They were breaths of air for drowning men, allowing the last of the team dragging the seriously wounded Diaz to tumble into the narrow cleft of the southern gorge Marcus had designated as their fallback point. Katerina was the last to pull back, firing one final deliberate shot at a flickering muzzle flash before sliding down the scree slope and vanishing into the darkness of the gorge's entrance. Inside, the contrast was immediate and jarring. The roar of the battle was instantly muffled by the towering walls of rock replaced by a tense, echoing quiet. The air was cold and damp. The gorge was a deep scar in the earth no more than 15 meters wide, with sheer weeping walls that climbed 100 meters to a sliver of gray sky. It was a fortress and a prison. Set a perimeter, Marcus's voice was a raw bark amplified by the natural acoustics of the canyon. Henderson's status on Diaz. He's bleeding bad, Lieutenant. 2 rounds in the femur, 1 shattered the tibia. I'm trying to stop the bleed, but he needs a surgeon, so. Doc Henderson's reply was frantic, his hands working with desperate speed on the mangled leg of the unconscious SEAL. The rest of the team moved with grim efficiency, taking up positions facing the entrance, their weapons trained on the opening, through which the sounds of the enemy now regrouping were growing louder. Marcus grabbed his youngest operator, a scout named Jester. Find us a way out the back of this thing. Go. Jester nodded, his youthful face pale and drawn, and disappeared into the deeper gloom of the canyon. Katerina didn't wait for orders. She found her own position, a high ledge 20 feet up the canyon wall that was accessible via a series of natural handholds. From there, she had a clear line of sight back to the entrance. She set up her rifle, her movements fluid and unhurried, a small island of calm in the sea of controlled panic. 5 minutes later, Jester returned, his breathing ragged. The look on his face said everything before he spoke. "It's a dead end, sir," he reported, his voice hollow. "Box Canyon. The back wall is a sheer cliff face, looks like there was a rock slide years ago. There's no way up, not without a full climbing kit, and a day to do it." A heavy silence fell over the small group. Marcus walked to the entrance of the gorge and peered cautiously around the edge. What he saw confirmed their fate. The enemy wasn't mounting a suicidal charge into the narrow opening. They were smarter than that. They were setting up positions on the cliffs above and around the entrance, fortifying, settling in. They had no intention of coming in. They were simply corking the bottle. He backed away from the edge, his face a grim mask of stone. He looked at his men, at Doc fighting to save Diaz, at Katerina watching from her perch like a stone gargoyle, and the full crushing weight of his decision landed on him. He had led them into a tomb. The Canyon of Death had earned its name. The first hour in the canyon was a slow bleed of adrenaline replaced by the cold, creeping poison of dread. The sporadic echo of enemy activity outside, a shouted command in a foreign tongue, the clatter of a machine gun being repositioned, served as a constant grinding reminder of their cage. Diaz was quiet now, stabilized by Doc Henderson, but pale and shivering under a thermal blanket, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Every man knew the unspoken truth: without evacuation, his wound was a death sentence. All their fragile hopes rested on a single piece of equipment. Marcus turned to his communications specialist, a lanky seal with prematurely graying hair nicknamed Sparks. "Sparks, get on the horn. I want a priority burst to Tosi. Tell them our position is compromised. We're boxed in multiple hostiles, one critical casualty. We need immediate QRF and KS." Sparks nodded, crawling to the relative safety of a deep alcove. He unslung the ANPRC-117G multiband radio, a piece of technology that was their sole umbilical cord to the outside world. He unfolded the satellite antenna, his movements precise and practiced. The team watched him, their faces tense with anticipation. The hum of the radio's internal fan was the only sound in the canyon, a fragile whisper of hope against the crushing silence. Trying to get a handshake with the satellite, Sparks muttered, adjusting the frequency. "These canyon walls are hell on the signal. Might take a minute." Minutes stretched into an eternity. Sparks reoriented the antenna, rebooted the system, and cycled through the preset channels. Nothing. Only the quiet hiss of static. A frown creased his forehead. Even with the interference, he should have been able to acquire a signal lock. "Something's not right," he said, his voice tight with frustration. He began a physical inspection of the unit, his fingers tracing the cables, checking the connections. Then he stopped. His whole body went rigid. He ran a hand along the back of the radio's casing, where it had been resting against his pack during the retreat. His fingers came away wet and sticky. He held them up. It wasn't blood. It was coolant fluid from a shattered capacitor. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to see this." Marcus crawled over. Sparks pointed to a small, jagged hole in the composite casing, no bigger than a thumbnail, the entry point of a stray piece of shrapnel. Inside, the intricate green and silver guts of the radio were mangled. A fine web of cracks radiated from the impact point across the main processing board. It was completely, irrevocably destroyed. Sparks looked up at his commander, his face ashen. "It's dead, sir. It must have taken a hit during the initial volley. The whole board is fried. We're dark." The words dropped into the canyon like stones into a deep well. "We're dark." The severing was complete. They weren't just a team operating behind enemy lines. They were ghosts. No one was coming for them because no one knew they needed to be saved. The world had forgotten them. Marcus felt the abyss open beneath him. The weight on his shoulders became a physical thing threatening to crush him. He looked at the faces of his men, now turned to him, their expressions a mixture of fear and defiance, searching for a sign, for a plan, for any reason to hope. From her perch, Katerina watched the scene unfold. She had seen the false hope coalesce around the radio, and she saw it shatter now. She felt no surprise, only a cold confirmation of her deepest tactical belief. Reliance on technology was a dependency, and every dependency was a potential weakness. She had always operated as if she were alone. Her rifle, her scope, her knowledge of the wind, those were her lifelines. The quiet certainty of her isolation was now shared by them all. The difference was she was accustomed to it. They were not. As daylight began to fail, the canyon walls seemed to draw closer, leaching the warmth from the air and the hope from the men trapped between them. The long, agonizing hours had passed in a state of grim vigilance, the silence broken only by the delirious moans of Petty Officer Diaz and the low, urgent whispers of Doc Henderson trying to comfort him. The despair was no longer a sudden shock. It had settled in a cold, heavy fog that permeated everything. The first crisis came as the sun dipped below the rim, painting the sliver of sky above in hues of blood and rust. Doc Henderson crawled over to Marcus, his face a mask of exhaustion and defeat. "Lieutenant, it's Diaz," he said, his voice raw. "His fever is spiking, infection is setting in. I've given him the last of the broad-spectrum antibiotics, and I'm almost out of morphine. He's going into septic shock. If we don't get him to a real medical facility within the next few hours, he's not going to make it." Marcus looked over at the young SEAL, now shivering violently, despite the thermal blanket. The commander's face, already etched with strain, seemed to harden into granite. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them real, a death sentence he had no power to commute. He could only nod a single sharp gesture of acknowledgement that felt like an admission of utter failure. As if summoned by their despair, the enemy reminded them of their absolute control. Without warning, the sharp crack of a high-velocity rifle shot echoed from the rim above. It wasn't the opening of an assault. It was a single contemptuous punctuation mark. The bullet ricocheted off the rock wall just above Jester's head, spraying his face with stinging stone chips. He cried out more in surprise than pain, but as he fell back, a second shot rang out, this one finding its mark. The round punched through the thick muscle of his shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the canyon floor. "Jester's hit," someone yelled. Doc Henderson, forced to abandon Diaz, scrambled over to the new casualty, his medical kit now looking terrifyingly light. The enemy sniper had proven their point. There was no safe place. They were merely targets in a shooting gallery, and the enemy could take their time picking them off one by one. The psychological blow was as damaging as the physical one. It introduced a new kind of terror, not the chaos of a firefight, but the cold, random cruelty of a patient executioner. Later, under the thin light of a new moon, Marcus did a quiet inventory. 2 men seriously wounded. Medical supplies all but gone. Less than 2 days' worth of water if they rationed severely. Ammunition was still plentiful, but there was a finite number of enemies it could kill, and an unknown number waiting for them in the dark. He felt the foundations of his command, of his very identity, as a leader who brought his men home crumbling to dust. He found a moment of solitude in the deepest shadow of the gorge, leaning his helmet against the cold, damp rock and closing his eyes. The faces of his men flashed in his mind, Diaz's pale and sweating, Jester's twisted in pain, the others their expressions grimly resigned. This was all on him. The dismissal of Katerina's warning, the pride, the relentless push forward. It was his hubris that had led them into this tomb. For the first time in his decorated career, Marcus Thorne, the unwavering leader of men, faced the suffocating, soul-crushing certainty that he was going to watch his entire team die, and he could do nothing to stop it. While despair settled like a shroud over the seals in the canyon floor on the high ledge, Katarina Volkov was at peace. The encroaching darkness, the biting cold, the palpable fear radiating from below these were not impediments to her. They were the elements of her craft. The world had shrunk to the circular view of her rifle scope, a place of profound clarity and singular purpose. She was not trapped. She was waiting. For hours, she remained almost unnervingly still, her body a testament to supreme physical and mental discipline. Her breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm that conserved warmth and energy. Her pulse was a steady, metronomic beat. While the men below wrestled with the ghosts of what-ifs and the terror of a slow death, Katarina was engaged in the painstaking, methodical work of the hunt. Her mind did not register their situation as a state of being besieged. She saw it as a tactical problem with a finite set of variables. The enemy in their arrogance had made a critical error. They had become static. By laying siege, they had transformed themselves from a fluid, unpredictable force into a stationary collection of targets. They believed they had built a cage for the seals, but in doing so they had unwittingly stepped into her hunting ground. Through the powerful optics of her scope, she began to map their world. She ignored the foot soldiers, the sentries pacing impatiently on the rim. They were irrelevant, the teeth and claws of the beast. She was looking for the brain. Her gaze swept the rock face in a meticulous grid pattern, noting every detail. A trail of discarded cigarette butts that indicated a command congregation point. The faint flicker of a handheld radio's screen in the darkness. The path a runner took to deliver messages between two key positions. She cataloged the sounds, filtering them through a library of battlefield experience. The disciplined bark of one particular voice always followed by a flurry of activity. The distinct metallic scrape of a tripod-mounted weapon being adjusted. These were the rhythms of the enemy camp, and with every passing hour she understood them more intimately. The enemy sniper who had shot Jester was her first object of professional curiosity. He was good, but he was also proud. He had fired from a well-concealed nest, but he hadn't moved after the shots. A mistake born of overconfidence. Katarina marked his position, a dark crevice high on the eastern wall. She could have taken him out an hour ago, but killing him now would only alert the others, make them change their patterns. He was more valuable to her, alive, a fixed point in her developing map of the enemy's command structure. As the moon climbed to its zenith, casting the canyon in a stark, monochromatic light, her patience was rewarded. A figure emerged near the position where she'd heard the authoritative voice. He was different from the others. He wore no helmet, and his movements were economical calm. Two others flanked him, listening intently as he pointed down into the darkness of the gorge, his gestures sharp and decisive. He was explaining their tomb to them. Katarina's breath caught for a fraction of a second. Her entire being focused, the crosshairs of her scope settling gently over the man's chest. This was not just a soldier. This was a commander. He was the center of the web. The despair below was a raw, emotional thing. The cold focus that filled Katarina now was its antithesis, a purely logical, predatory certainty. The variables of the problem were beginning to simplify. The path out of the abyss was not a radio call or a rescue team. It was here in her scope, in the form of a single, unsuspecting man. The man on the ridge was the center of his own small universe. For the next hour, Katarina did not move, her eye pressed to the scope, her world contracting to this single illuminated circle of observation. She watched him dissected his every action, and with each passing minute, her initial hypothesis hardened into certainty. This was not just a commander. He was the commander, the architect of their tomb. She saw the proof in the deference of his subordinates. Runners would approach his position, a natural alcove of rock reinforced with sandbags, and speak to him with a hurried, tense energy. The commander would listen, nod, and reply with a calm, quiet authority, often gesturing towards a map spread on a flat rock before him. After these brief interactions, the runners would scurry away into the darkness, and minutes later she would see a shift in the enemy's disposition. A machine gun nest being repositioned, a patrol's route being altered. All orders flowed from him. He was the queen on the chessboard. His position was cleverly chosen. The alcove protected him from direct assault and shielded him almost completely from above. He was visible only in brief, fleeting moments, when he leaned out to survey the canyon below or when he moved from the cover of the overhang to speak with a subordinate. These windows of opportunity were short, lasting no more than a few seconds at a time, and they were unpredictable. He was a ghost who materialized and vanished at will. Katerina began to analyze the shot. It was a problem of terrifying complexity. The distance was extreme, over 900 meters. The angle was severe, a steep downward trajectory that would require complex ballistic calculations to compensate for gravity's exaggerated pull. The wind, her eternal adversary, was a chaotic mess gusting down the canyon from one direction and swirling back up from another. But the greatest challenge was the target itself, a man who offered only a sliver of himself for seconds at a time, behind a barrier of solid rock. This was not a shot one could rush. It required a deep, almost Zen-like understanding of the environment, a perfect union of math instinct and timing. It was the kind of shot that existed at the very edge of the possible, the kind that would become a legend if made and a death sentence if missed. A miss would not only waste a precious round, it would betray her position instantly, drawing the full concentrated fury of the enemy down upon her and the men below. Yet, as she processed these obstacles, she felt no fear. Instead, she felt a profound sense of clarity. She understood the tactical reality with an insight that transcended the despair gripping the rest of the team. Their thinking was linear, they were trapped, so they needed to be rescued. Her thinking was lateral, the enemy's strength, their disciplined coordination, was also their greatest weakness. It was all centralized in the man in her scope. He was the key. He was the single point of failure in their enemy's masterfully constructed machine. Killing his soldiers would be like trimming the branches of a tree. Killing him would be like striking the root with an axe. Without his leadership, the coordinated siege would fracture. Discipline would erode into confusion. The pack of wolves would devolve into a scattered collection of hungry dogs. The moon cast a sliver of pale light onto her rifle. It wasn't a glimmer of hope from the outside world. It was a glimmer born here in the darkness, forged from patience, observation, and the cold, deadly calculus of a hunter. She now possessed the one thing that could change their fate. It wasn't a radio. It was a single, impossibly difficult, necessary piece of information. With the deliberate, silent grace of a predator, Katerina descended from her ledge. Her movement was a whisper in the gloom, and she materialized at the edge of the team's makeshift command post so quietly that Marcus Thorne didn't notice her until she spoke. "Lieutenant." He looked up, startled. His face was a portrait of exhaustion, the skin stretched taut over his cheekbones, his eyes bloodshot from staring into the oppressive darkness. He was kneeling beside Diaz, whose breathing was now shallow and ragged. The air around them was thick with the smell of antiseptic and impending death. Katerina wasted no time on pleasantries. Her voice was low and flat, a factual report delivered without emotion. "I have the enemy commander. I've had him for the last 3 hours." The statement hung in the cold air. A few of the nearby SEALs who had been listlessly cleaning their weapons stopped and looked over their expressions, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Marcus stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "I have identified the single individual directing the siege." She continued, her tone unchanging. "He's positioned in a fortified alcove on the eastern rim, approximately 920 meters from my perch. All orders flow through him. His removal will decapitate their command structure and collapse their coordination." Marcus rose slowly to his feet, a spark of something incredulity, perhaps a flicker of anger igniting in his eyes. "You have a target you can't hit. That's not a solution, Sergeant. That's a geography lesson." "I can hit him," Katerina said. The certainty in her voice was absolute. "But there is only one opportunity. He is well protected, but he's arrogant. He periodically moves from behind his main cover to a map table. When he does for approximately 3 seconds, his head and torso are framed perfectly through a narrow V-shaped gap between 2 boulders far behind his position." She paused, letting the sheer improbability of her words sink in. "It is a keyhole shot. At night. With a variable crosswind. I would be firing through a window no wider than a man's shoulders from nearly a kilometer away." The quiet audacity of the proposal silenced the entire canyon. The SEALs were now all listening, their weariness momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stunned awe. They were trained for direct, overwhelming action, for fighting their way out of impossible situations, with sheer firepower and aggression. This was something else entirely. This was the stuff of myth, a single perfect bullet, to solve an unsolvable problem. Marcus scrubbed a hand over his face. He felt a dizzying sense of unreality. And the risk, he asked, his voice a low rasp. Katerina's gaze was unwavering. "The risk is total," she said with brutal honesty. "My muzzle flash will be a beacon. If I miss, if the wind pushes the round 6 inches to the left, if he moves a second too soon, if my calculation is off by a single degree, the enemy will know my exact location. They will saturate my position with every heavy weapon they have. I will not get a second shot. And they will know our last hope is gone." She had laid it all out. The slimmest chance of survival balanced against the certainty of her own death and their ultimate failure, if she was anything less than perfect. It was not a plan born of hope. It was a solution forged from the cold, hard logic of desperation. It was by any rational military doctrine an impossible proposition. And yet it was the only proposition they had. The silence that followed Katerina's proposition was heavier than the tons of rock pressing in on them. Every man in the canyon, save for the delirious Diaz, was looking at Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne. They were waiting for his judgment, for his command. In that moment, Marcus felt the loneliest he had ever been in his life. The choice before him was not between a good option and a bad one, but between 2 different kinds of doom. He walked away from the group, needing a few feet of space to think, though there was nowhere to go. His mind, a machine trained for rapid tactical assessment, cycled through the alternatives. The first option was his own, the hopeless defense. They would hold the canyon. They would ration their water, consolidate their ammunition, and prepare for an inevitable final assault. But he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty what the outcome would be. Diaz would die before morning. Jester's wound would fester. Thirst would set in within 48 hours. Their disciplined defense would slowly crumble under the relentless pressure of starvation sickness and the enemy's patient psychological warfare. They would die here not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, degrading collapse. It wasn't a plan. It was a protracted death sentence. The second option was Katerina's the impossible shot. It went against every tenet of his training. He was a SEAL. His doctrine was built on the principles of direct action, overwhelming force, and the flawless execution of a team. He solved problems by putting rounds on target until the problem went away. He did not solve them by gambling the lives of his entire platoon on a single miraculous bullet fired by an outsider. It was the stuff of movies, not war. But then his gaze fell on Katerina. She stood perfectly still, her rifle held at a low ready, her expression unreadable. She wasn't asking for his permission out of protocol. She was offering him a solution. And as he looked at her, the memory of her earlier warning echoed in his mind, a phantom voice of ignored reason. The disposition feels prepared. She had seen the trap. She had warned him, and he, in his professional arrogance and the unshakable confidence of a SEAL leader, had dismissed her. His pride had led them here. His way had failed utterly and catastrophically. He looked back at his men. He saw the flicker of desperation in their eyes, the unspoken plea for a way out, that they were all too disciplined to voice. He looked at Diaz, whose life was now measured in minutes. The choice was no longer abstract. It was between the certainty of watching his men die following his failed plan, or the infinitesimal chance of saving them by trusting the skills of the woman he had wronged. It was a choice between his pride and their lives. And for a man like Marcus Thorne, when framed that way, there was no choice at all. He turned back to Katerina, his decision made. The internal conflict ceased, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "What do you need?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried the full weight of his authority. Katerina's expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not surprise, but acknowledgement. "A spotter. One of your men with a good scope to watch for the bullet trace and confirm the impact. And I need everyone else to be ready. Ready for what asked one of the SEALs. Ready for the chaos," Katerina answered. "If I make the shot, their command structure will shatter. They will be confused, disorganized. That will be your window to counterattack. It will be the only one you get." Marcus nodded, accepting the new reality. He had lost control of their fate, and now he had to embrace the loss. He turned to his men. "You heard her. Lock and load. Be ready to move on my signal. We are leaving this tomb one way or another." He then looked directly at Katerina, his gaze meeting hers across the darkness. "Take the shot, Sergeant." Time seemed to warp in the canyon, stretching and compressing, as Katerina and her designated spotter, a seasoned SEAL named Hawk, ascended back to the sniper's perch. Below them, the remaining members of the team took their positions, a silent, lethal readiness replacing their earlier despair. Every man understood that the next few minutes would determine the outcome of their lives. The entire canyon, friend and foe alike, seemed to be holding its breath, caught in a state of suspended animation. On the ledge, the preparation was a silent, meticulous ritual. There was no wasted movement, no whispered doubt. Hawk set up his own spotting scope, focusing it on the target area, his job to watch for the vapor trail of the bullet and confirm the impact. Katerina lay prone, becoming one with the rock beneath her. She made a final infinitesimal adjustment to the parallax on her scope, ensuring the reticle and the target were on the same focal plane. She checked the readings on her handheld weather meter again. The wind had shifted 0.5 mile per hour, a negligible change to most, but at this distance it was the difference between a kill and a catastrophic miss. She updated the firing solution in her mind, a complex tapestry of mathematics and instinct. The distance 920 meters, the angle 33 degrees. The bullet would travel in a high arc before dropping nearly 40 feet to the target. The wind, a fickle beast, was gusting from right to left. meaning she would have to aim a full body length to the right of the commander, trusting the unseen current of air to deliver the round to its intended destination. She was not aiming at the man. She was aiming at a single invisible point in space where she predicted he and the bullet would meet. "I'm set," she murmured, her voice barely a disturbance in the air. "Spotter is set." Hawk replied, his eye pressed to his scope. No sign of the target. "We wait." And so they waited. Below, Marcus stood like a statue, his gaze fixed on the ledge where Katerina lay. He had placed the fate of his men, his brothers, into the hands of a woman whose methods were alien to him. He had never felt so powerless nor so strangely calm. The decision was made. The die was cast. Now there was only the waiting. The minutes crawled by. A pebble dislodged by the wind clattered down the cliff face, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. Then Hawk's voice, a tense, controlled whisper. "Target is approaching the map table. Stand by." Katerina's body seemed to relax, to flow into the rifle stock. Her breathing, already slow, became almost imperceptible. She exhaled, emptying her lungs, and entered the natural respiratory pause, the moment of perfect bodily stillness between breaths. "Target is in the window," Hawk confirmed. Through the scope, the world vanished. There was no cold, no fear, no team below. There was only the illuminated crosshair, the slight tremor of her own impossibly steady heartbeat, and the distant, unsuspecting figure of the enemy commander. He leaned over his map, his head and shoulders perfectly framed in the V-shaped gap of rock, just as she had predicted. She was the creator of this moment. Everything, every hour of training, every calculation, every life she had ever taken, had led to this single, perfect point in time. Her finger began to tighten on the trigger, taking up the 2 pounds of pressure moving through the empty space before the break. The canyon was silent. The world was silent. The trigger broke with a clean, crisp snap, as precise and definite as a shard of ice cracking. The MK-13 rifle kicked back into Katerina's shoulder, a familiar solid punch that she absorbed with her entire body. For a fraction of a second, the world through her scope was a blur of controlled recoil and muted muzzle flash. Her training took over instantly. Her hand moved with fluid autonomy, working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, and chambering a new round. It was a useless action. She knew there would be no second shot, but it was a ritual of readiness that could not be broken. Then came the longest second of her life. The 338 caliber bullet, weighing just over 19 grams, left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It tore through the cold night air, an invisible harbinger of fate spinning at a dizzying rate to stabilize its long journey. For 1.2 agonizing seconds, it traveled across the vast, dark expanse, separating the hunter from her prey. On the ledge, Katerina was already back on target, watching through the scope, her breath still held in the perfect stillness of her respiratory pause. Beside her, Hawk strained to see the bullet's trace, a faint shimmer in the air, a ghost of its passage. Down below, the SEALs heard it, not a loud crack, but a heavy, suppressed thump. A sound more felt than heard, like a fist hitting a sandbag. It was the only sound in the universe. They remained frozen, weapons raised, every man a coiled spring of violent potential waiting. Marcus stared up at the ridgeline, his heart hammering against his ribs, his entire world hanging in that single eternal second of silence. Then, through Katerina's scope, the moment resolved. The commander, who had been gesturing confidently at his map, suddenly stopped. His head snapped back, his body went rigid for an instant, and then he simply collapsed, folding in on himself like a puppet with its strings cut. He vanished from the V-shaped window, his place taken by empty night air. There was no sound, no cry, only a clean, silent removal. Hawk's voice crackled over the internal comm, sharp and electric, with adrenaline and disbelief. packed, good impact. Target is down, I confirm. Target is down. For a moment, nothing on the ridge changed. The enemy sentries continued their patrols, unaware that their brain had just been severed from their body. Then one of the commander's aides peered into the alcove, a shout of alarm thin and reedy at this distance. Then another. Figures began to run their movements, frantic, disorganized. The disciplined machine of the siege ground to a halt. Shouted orders became confused questions. The web, its center, now a void, began to unravel into a tangle of useless threads. The chaos Katerina had predicted was blossoming before their eyes. Down in the canyon, Marcus heard Hawk's confirmation and saw the frantic, panicked movements starting on the rim. It was the window. The impossible had happened. The sliver of a chance had become a reality. He keyed his calm, his voice a low, vicious roar that tore through the silence. All stations, Viper 1, execute, execute, execute. The despair that had held them captive for so long instantly combusted, transformed into pure, focused rage. The canyon of death, their intended tomb, was about to become the crucible of their violent rebirth. The moment Marcus gave the order, the canyon vomited fire and steel. The 5 remaining SEALs, a unit teetering on the edge of annihilation, just moments before transformed into a singular entity of controlled violence. The despair that had gnawed at them for hours was gone, burned away by a clean, white-hot fury. This was their element, the bloody crucible for which they had been forged. From the mouth of the gorge, they unleashed a perfectly coordinated barrage. A light machine gunner laid down a torrent of suppressive fire on the enemy positions directly overlooking the entrance, the sheer volume of rounds forcing the enemy to take cover. Under that protective blanket of noise and lead, 2 others launched their remaining grenades, the explosions blossoming into orange and black flowers of shrapnel and concussion on the ridge. It was a violent, shocking declaration. The prey had become the predator. High above, Katerina's role shifted with the changing tide of battle. Her rifle was no longer a scalpel for a single surgical strike, but a hammer to shatter the enemy's remaining cohesion. As the SEALs began their assault, her scope swept the battlefield, identifying and eliminating the next greatest threats in a deadly, methodical sequence. A machine gunner attempting to bring his weapon to bear on the advancing team fell silent. An enemy soldier shouting orders, trying to rally a defense, collapsed in mid-sentence. Her rifle spoke with a calm, deliberate rhythm, each shot another nail in the coffin of the enemy's organized resistance. The SEALs moved with breathtaking speed and efficiency, a blur of motion and violence. They burst from the mouth of the canyon, not in a desperate scramble, but in a disciplined, aggressive charge. They were no longer defending, they were attacking. The psychological shock to the leaderless enemy was total. The force they had considered trapped and dying was now a charging behemoth, seemingly impervious and unstoppable. Marcus was at the forefront, his M4 barking in short, controlled bursts. He moved with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt since the mission began. He was no longer a commander weighed down by a fatal mistake, but a warrior fighting for the lives of his brothers. The fear and guilt were still there, but they had been converted into fuel for the fire. He saw a group of enemy fighters attempting to flank his team and cut them down without hesitation, his movements economical and lethal. The enemy's siege, so masterfully constructed, shattered under the ferocity of the assault. Without their commander to direct them, they were just scattered individuals, their brief moments of panicked resistance quickly overwhelmed by the SEALs' focused aggression. The hunters became the hunted, caught, completely off balance, their superior numbers rendered useless by their own confusion. In less than 5 minutes, it was over. The SEALs had punched a bloody hole through the cordon and were moving through the enemy's former positions. They did not stop to celebrate or even to catch their breath. They kept moving, putting distance between themselves and the shattered remnants of the enemy force. They were not safe, not yet, but they were free. They were no longer pinned, no longer waiting for death in a cage of rock. The initiative was theirs, bought with one perfect bullet, and paid for in blood and fury. They had been to the abyss, and they had clawed their way back out. They stopped miles from the canyon in a thick copse of ancient firs that offered concealment and a defensible position. The frantic energy of the breakout had bled away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion that was heavier than any pack. As the first pale gray fingers of dawn probed the eastern sky, the true cost of their victory began to reveal itself in the unforgiving light. The faces of the seals were gaunt, smeared with grime and cordite, their eyes hollowed out by the horrors of the long night. They gathered in a tight, silent circle. Jester, his face pale with pain, was being tended to by Doc Henderson, who was stitching the wound on his shoulder with a grim focus. But their attention and their grief was directed at the figure lying on a makeshift litter on the ground. Petty Officer Diaz had survived the battle, but he had not survived the weight. Sometime during the frantic exfiltration, his fight had ended. Doc Henderson, after a long moment of checking for any sign of life, finally looked up at Marcus, his expression bleak. "He's gone, Lieutenant. I'm sorry. He lost too much blood, the infection. There was nothing more I could do." The words didn't need to be said. Every man had known it was coming. But the finality of it was a crushing weight. They had won. They had broken the siege. But they had still been too late to save one of their own. There was no ceremony, only a profound shared silence. Each man was alone with his grief, with the memory of a fallen brother whose death felt less like a casualty of war and more like a consequence of failure. Slightly apart from the group, Katerina stood sentinel, her back to them, cleaning her rifle with meticulous practiced movements. It was her ritual, a way of resetting her mind, of drawing a line between the visceral chaos of the fight and the cold, clean precision of her craft. She gave the men their space, understanding that their grief was a private, sacred thing she had no part in. She was still the outsider, the architect of their salvation, but not a member of their family. After a long time, Marcus moved. He walked past his men, his steps heavy, and approached Katerina. The other SEALs watched the quiet tension returning. He stopped a few feet from her. She did not turn, but her hands stilled, sensing his presence. He said nothing. There were no words that could adequately convey the maelstrom of gratitude, respect, and shame that churned within him. A thank you felt insultingly small. An apology for his doubt felt self-serving, so he remained silent. Instead, he unclipped a canteen from his belt, one of his last, and held it out to her. It was a simple gesture, the universal sign of a soldier acknowledging another. Katerina finally turned her gaze, meeting his. In his eyes, she saw it all. The burden of command, the weight of his fallen man, the quiet agony of his initial mistake. And beneath it all, a new, profound, and unconditional respect. It was a silent, absolute acknowledgement of her skill, her courage, her worth. He was not looking at a female soldier or an allied attachment. He was looking at the warrior who had saved his entire team. She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She took the canteen, drank from it, and handed it back. The transaction was complete. The unspoken was understood. In that silent exchange and the bloody light of the new dawn, the final barrier between them dissolved, forged into something stronger by the shared crucible of combat. This has been more than just a tale of survival. It is a testament to the fact that true strength lies not in overwhelming force, but in quiet precision, unwavering courage, and the profound humility to trust in skill no matter its vessel. The story of Katarina Volkov and SEAL Team 7 serves as a powerful reminder that in the moments that truly define us, labels like gender, nationality, and rank fall away, leaving only the core of a warrior's character. It is a narrative about how respect is not given, but forged in the fires of adversity, and how even in the deepest abyss of despair, a single act of focused brilliance can bring about a bloody, beautiful dawn. Stories like this, which delve into the depths of the human spirit and honor the silent bonds created in the crucible of conflict, are the ones we are dedicated to telling. If you were moved by this journey and wish to explore more narratives that champion the quiet heroes and the impossible moments that shape our world, consider subscribing to our channel. By joining us, you support the creation of stories that matter, tales of resilience, honor, and the extraordinary power of a single determined individual. Thank you for walking with us through the canyon of death and for witnessing the legacy of that one bullet. Until the next story, stay vigilant. 2 weeks later, the world was a different place. The raw, brutal wilderness of the Eastern European mountains had been replaced by the sterile, ordered confines of a forward operating base. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and dust, and the constant thrum of generators had replaced the whisper of the wind through rock. For the survivors of SEAL Team 7, it was a return to a kind of normalcy, but they were not the same men who had left. They carried the canyon with them. It was in the quiet, haunted look in their eyes, in the way they moved with a grim economy that hadn't been there before. Jester's arm was in a sling, a physical reminder of the cost. The empty bunk in their barracks where Diaz should have been was a permanent, silent testament to the price of their survival. And a story had returned with them. It wasn't in the official after-action reports, which were masterpieces of dry, classified language. It lived in the spaces between words, in the quiet conversations in the mess hall, and the respectful silence that fell whenever Sergeant Katarina Volkov entered a room. They didn't call it a miracle. They called it the canyon shot, or simply the Volkov shot. It was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by other hardened operators, men who had seen everything and were impressed by nothing. The story of a team trapped facing certain death, saved by one woman and a single impossible bullet, had already begun its journey into legend. The subject of that legend, however, remained unchanged. Katarina did not participate in the retelling of the story. She did not seek accolades or recognition. Her days were spent the same way they always were, in methodical, focused discipline. She was found most often on the long-distance firing range, her body prone behind the familiar form of her rifle, her mind lost in the complex poetry of ballistics. She was a master craftsman, and the battle had simply been a moment where her craft was tested to its absolute limit. She sought no glory for it. The perfect execution of her skill was its own reward. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, Marcus Thorne sat before a screen, typing the final lines of his official report. He had detailed the mission's catastrophic failure, taking full responsibility for the decisions that led to the ambush. He had also detailed its conclusion. He paused as he came to the commendations section, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed out a recommendation for Katarina, not just for a Medal of Valor, but for the highest honor the coalition forces could bestow. In the cold official language, he described the shot as an act of unparalleled skill and courage under extreme duress. But the words felt inadequate. They couldn't capture the truth of what had happened in that canyon. The real change was not on the paper. It was inside him. His worldview, once so rigidly defined by the insular brotherhood of the SEALs, had been irrevocably altered. He no longer saw uniforms or nationalities or genders. He saw only warriors. And Katarina Volkov was the finest warrior he had ever known. The legacy of the shot was not the impossible victory, nor the legend it created. It was the quiet, undeniable truth it had revealed. As the sun set over the dusty base, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the distant range. It was Katerina practicing her craft. The sound was a final clear statement in the moments that matter when the abyss opens and hope is a forgotten luxury. The things that define a person are stripped away. All that remains is character and the skill to turn a single bullet from a piece of lead into an instrument of salvation.